And we are back. The South Bronx's history since the 1950s is marked by deep-seated social injustices, including white flight, landlord abandonment, economic shifts, demographic changes, and the construction of the Cross Bronx Expressway. These historical factors continue to shape the area today, giving rise to initiatives like South Bronx Unite. Residents of the South Bronx strive for fair access to clean air, nutritious food, affordable quality housing, and also healthcare, education, stable employment, and livable wages, plus a whole lot more. Here to share more, we've got the Clean Air Program Coordinator, Leslie Vasquez, with us. And Leslie, good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me
You
here.
know, I'm rambling down a list of so many things, but it's really an issue because when you think about the issues that South Bronxites have faced for such a long time, um, I've named about 8 there, but there's so many more that you can name, but progress is being made.
Correct. That's correct.
So give us a little.
Yeah. So we represent the Mott Haven and Port Morris neighborhoods of the South Bronx, and we are located in a peninsula where we have no access to our waterfront. Our waterfront is ground zero for warehouses, polluting facilities like power plants, waste transfer stations. We have 3 major highways crossing through the centers of our community, on top of the lack of health service opportunities, on top of lack of employment resources, and many other things. Because of that, our community is extremely vulnerable compared to other communities in New York City. We have one of the highest asthma rates in the whole country, and we have one of the lowest green space per capita in the city as well. Because of all of those injustices combined, our community has to experience cumulative health impacts like asthma and other respiratory illnesses. And so what South Bronx Unite tries to do is tries to fix those issues so that our community isn't as vulnerable as they are today. We want to be as resourceful, as proactive as possible, and the only way that we do that is through our community engagement and through the support of our community members and whatnot.
Yeah. Sometimes community members have a hard time getting on board with advocacy only because they're so overburdened by what's going on in their own lives. What are you finding among South Bronxites these days? Because as we know, the issues are many, but where there's strength, there's numbers, right? There's strength in numbers. How are you coming along in the strength in numbers fight?
Yeah, so we try to be as active as possible with an organization of 3 people. We are a little strapped in capacity, but nonetheless, we still try to have community engagement efforts every single month, especially throughout the warmer months. And so we host community events monthly, and we collaborate with other organizations to do the same in other parts of New York City. But the more people that we bring to our events to provide purpose and intention to our programs, to collect their feedback, to better shape our policies and better shape our efforts moving forward, that's what really guides our work. That's what moves us forward. And so, like you said, it is tricky to get people to come outside and advocate when they're overburdened by everything that's happening in their lives. But really, the South Bronx is so beautiful because it's so rich in culture. Everybody's always outside. There's always something going on. And even if you don't know about an event that's happening, you just happen to stumble across one. And so engagement is very, very lively in the South Bronx. And although we would love to get many, many, many more participants to support our work and to see what we're doing, the participants that we do have now and the people who support our work are incredible people, and they're residents of the area. They experience all of these injustices firsthand. And so we see that as great numbers, regardless of how many they are.
So when you talk about being an organizer for the clean air, obviously we want to see better air in the South Bronx. We want to see better air across the borough. How much have these wildfires really impacted and further compounded what we're seeing in the South Bronx?
Yeah, because we've have such a high concentration of pollution, the wildfires that came from Canada a couple of weeks back were so much more visible in our community specifically because we already had high pollution rates. And so although the wildfires were experienced all throughout New York State and other parts of the country, the South Bronx had worst air quality issues from before, and we also had to deal with other cumulative health impacts in the past, meaning that when we had an extreme weather event like the Canada wildfire emergency, our communities were that much more vulnerable because they were already affected in other ways before. We had higher hospitalization rates, like we do always, but with the Canada wildfires, it was that much more apparent how much of a disproportion there is with the resources that are available compared to other parts of the city.
We hear a lot about the word racism. We talk about that here on the show quite a lot. But when we talk about environmental racism, that takes on a different type.
Yes.
Somebody may not be familiar with environmental racism. So let's educate viewers, first of all, on what is environmental racism.
Yeah, so environmental racism is deeply rooted in the racist policies that we've had to deal with for decades. Because of redlining, the South Bronx is considered as, it's not as desirable because of that stereotype that was placed from many years ago. And because of that, there has been less funding, there's less programs, and there is less consideration of the residents in the area. All of that combined together has led to us becoming more vulnerable, and our environment is working against us because we don't have the government to help support us. Like I mentioned, we have higher rates of pollution. We have a high concentration of polluting facilities compared to many other parts of the city. And so all of these things aren't a coincidence. There is so much evidence that proves that our community, who is primarily of color, who is primarily low income, and who faces a myriad of different injustices, they're the ones who are experiencing the brunt of environmental impacts. They're the ones who are experiencing the environment at a completely different level than the rest of the people in New York City and other parts of the country as well. So when it comes to environmental racism, all of the historical impacts that our communities have had to deal with are combined with the externalities that our environment brings. And it doesn't help our case. We are vulnerable because of the lack of prioritization that our communities get. And all of that together is receding us back. And yeah, that's what we're trying to fight against.
What about the response? Because as we sound the alarm, the question is whether or not anybody's come to aid, and whether or not that's going to be, my needs are going to be met. Because we know that when you ride along the Cross Bronx and you're stuck in traffic and those fumes are out there, not only do they impact the driver behind, but it leaves behind that air that is breathed in by so many residents. And we know about the asthma, we know about high blood pressure and all these other things that have been these health factors that are actually attributed. But when we sound the alarm, and we need the parties to come to the table and say, listen, we're going to do something about that. Where are we at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the biggest contributor to pollution in that South Bronx area is cars, trucks, and medium to heavy duty vehicles. Medium to heavy duty vehicles are essentially any vehicle that is larger than 10,000 pounds. So any school bus, a large pickup truck would be considered one of those. They're mostly run by diesel, which is extremely problematic in terms of the health impacts that it brings to the community. And because, like you said, that exhaust lingers in the air, that's the air that our communities breathe. And so my role as a Clean Air Program organizer is to transition the South Bronx to a fully electric medium to heavy duty vehicle sector so that we can reduce those levels of pollution, being that the warehouses, the highways, and everything in the area is contributing to that high rate of pollution. And so we at South Bronx Unite are trying to mitigate that issue by electrifying the vehicles that are impacting our area. And that's one aspect, but the city is also working on implementing a congestion pricing proposal, which is essentially going to redirect a whole bunch of traffic into the South Bronx. And we're trying to fight against that because we don't need any more pollution. We cannot make our communities any more vulnerable than what they already are. And so at South Bronx Unite, we are trying to avoid that issue of redirection of traffic into our area. And those are some of the things that we're doing actively to prevent those things.
How can the public join in on this? Because obviously public support continues with, the more the numbers, the greater the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So how do we create the squeak, if you will, so that way we can be able to get more people out, active, combining forces with South Bronx Unite?
Yeah, so there are public comment periods, there's feedback discussions, there's community workshops for all of these efforts that are happening for congestion pricing, for electrification, and for many other policies. The best way that a community member can help is by being active in those engagement efforts, by providing that feedback, by voicing their lived experiences in the community. They're able to shape and hone the policies that we're trying to build. And so being an active participant in engagements like those is super important. We have a newsletter as well as many other grassroots environmental justice organizations in the city where we share those efforts, where we share action items that people can take on, like signing on to a petition or submitting a comment letter. And so those are efforts that we try to do that help our community become more involved. And you can sign up for things like those in our website or any other environmental justice organizations.
The biggest question I have is when it comes to equity, right? We always have this conversation when we talk about social justice, equality, and equity. Two totally different things.
Yeah.
And, while people will push the envelope and say, we've got equality, the reality is that many times there's not equity. And so why is it so challenging to see equity just in fundamental areas where it seems like a no-brainer, but it seems like we've got to have 5 meetings and 6 conversations to be able to just bring equity to something that seems so regular?
That's actually a great point because you mentioned that the Canada wildfires is something that is pressing, and we've had issues like the Canada wildfires, like that awful air quality, maybe not as bad, but the South Bronx always has bad air quality.
Right.
And when you mention equity, why is it that this air quality issue becomes so important when it affects the rest of the world, but not when it affects communities of color that are vulnerable and have been historically marginalized, like the South Bronx? When it comes to equity, we have to include communities that are marginalized, that are vulnerable first, and then address the rest of the world and the rest of the issues that trickle down to other communities. Not saying that other communities aren't vulnerable or that they don't need help, but our community has been suffering for so long, and again, we have so much proof that our health is deteriorating on a daily basis because of environmental impacts that are outside of our control. And so in order for us to do this equitably, we need to include community members' voices, and we need to address the communities that are vulnerable first, because there's a lot of prioritization for other communities that are wealthier and that have resources and funds. But they already have proper air quality. They already have green spaces. We need to address the ones that don't have any of that consideration first.
Right. And so what's on your radar right now that people could be paying attention to say, listen, I'm going to laser in on and possibly join the fight?
Yeah. So we are working on implementing 25 air quality monitors throughout the South Bronx. With that data, we will make it publicly accessible. It's going to be transparent so that anybody can access it at whatever time. There's a lot of air quality monitoring efforts throughout the Bronx and other parts of the city, but we really wanted to focus on having very detailed data for our South Bronx area specifically. We will be moving forward with that work in the next couple of months, and we will be adding stories to it. We will be implementing community members' voices and feedback so that it can back up our programs and it could justify why we are doing the work that we are. And so, like I said, we have newsletters where we provide actions that can help us move forward. And so, to stay tuned, to stay active, we encourage people to participate in as many efforts as possible.
Well, Leslie, we got to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining us and being with us. And we'll continue to follow the work.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Appreciate you.
And we'll be back with more right after this.